Well, my parents always took my sister and me to museums, so I just grew up with an appreciation of art, and it wasn't until I was a senior in high school that I took an art history class, and it was a revelation. It was like I'd always known it, but I just had to let it sink in. I took my first art history class at Punahou School in Honolulu, Hawaii, when I was a senior. Same school that Obama went to. He was a year behind me. I did not know him. And the art history class was just a revelation. It just was the answer to everything I'd been looking for without even realizing it. So I went to Smith because I understood that it had a really good art history program. At that time it was nationally famous. And I had the most marvelous professors, but no one was teaching Egyptian material. I didn't know anything about it. And I went to Bryn Mawr College to study with Dale Kinney, who specializes in early medieval Rome. She's an architectural historian, among other things. And I came across the Egyptian Christian material and immediately had a strong kind of gut reaction to it, a really powerful one. And she pointed out to me that the art historians who've been working on it had for some time been interested in the subject of the nursing Virgin Mary. And so I did a paper on that for her, and it ended up turning into my dissertation. Well, my dissertation was on the nursing Virgin Mary, and I received a fellowship from the American Research Center in Egypt. It was my first trip to Egypt ever. I was petrified, and I completely fell in love with it, and received so much support from the RC staff. It was unbelievable. Madam Amira and Amir and the various directors were always just great. So after that first trip to research my dissertation, I ended up being invited to participate in the Monastery of St. Anthony project, wall painting conservation project. I was invited to be the art historian for the project and write a book. And so I remember asking Michael Jones, how big can I think? And he said, you think as big as you like and I'll see what I can do. And so I ended up not writing some small guide or even a self-authored book. I ended up editing a large volume with lots of contributors, and we were able to study the monument from a bunch of different exciting perspectives. So the final sum of the scholarship ended up being much greater than I could have done myself. So the Monastery of St. Anthony is the home of the man who's reputed to have been the father of monasticism, St. Anthony the Great. He was a great ascetic who lived in the desert, and he had followers, and eventually a monastery grew up around his memory, his name, and he's famous around the world in Christian monasteries for being the father of monasticism. And his monastery now has some important historic remains, not from the earliest period, except his cave is believed to be halfway up the mountain behind the monastery. So if you hike up there, you can see a cave. It's very dark. It's very dark. It's not too big. It's quite plausibly his cave, but who knows? At least I don't know. Let's put it that way. But the church, we thought the church was 13th century because it has 13th century paintings that are dated. And when I actually first went to see that church with Dr. Gaudat Gabra, who was on leave from being director of the Coptic Museum, we went to see it, and everything was so blackened. I was so disappointed that I couldn't see the paintings. I didn't even take pictures, which is like revolutionary for me because I always take pictures. So then I ended up being involved in this project, and I used to be able to go and spend a couple of weeks there and see the magic that the conservators did. I mean, they removed this extraordinary, these layers of soot and dirt and dust, and revealed extraordinary paintings, really, really powerful, exciting paintings. And so they taught me, in a sense, that experience taught me to be able to see through the grime and actually understand a little bit about what was underneath it. And it was just such a great privilege to work with Adriano Luzzi, who sadly passed away, and Luigi de Cesaris, who also passed away. Adriano used to, every once in a while, he would say, "Betsy, come here." And he would go to a part of the wall that just looked to me like it had dirty plaster. and he would tap on it, and he would say, "I think there's a painting under there," and then there would be. I mean, he was a maestro of just unparalleled discernment, and he also had a great sense of humor. So I miss them both very much. So while we were finishing that project, I went to the Red and White monasteries for the first time. I was with Salima Ikram, Nicholas Warner, and the man who became my husband, William Lister. And this is going to sound very corny, but I walked into the Red Monastery Church and I felt this whole body experience, like my destiny has changed, like just moved. And it was not necessarily a good experience. I felt sick to my stomach, like, oh my gosh, how am I gonna make this happen? Like, this is huge. How can I make this happen? But I had been taught, as I said, to see through the crime, and so I just looked around and I knew that there was something amazing there. I also knew that the architecture was quite extraordinary, and that the architecture told a very different story than the traditional, pretty much racist story that art historians of the Egyptian Christian material have told over the decades, and that was a new story that the story needed to be changed. So they basically created a model according to which monks in Upper Egypt were ignorant, illiterate, dirty, dark-skinned, and according to Charles Rufus Maury, they had a racial aversion to Hellenism, which is just a staggering thing to say. And he and other art historians, some of them great art historians, did not see Egypt as playing a part in the larger early Byzantine world of artistic formation. And they were able to explain this to themselves because they were looking at portable objects. And so they had preconceived ideas. If something's beautiful, if it's made of gold, if it's high quality silver, if it's silk, it's from Constantinople. Or maybe Antioch, possibly Alexandria, but probably not. And they were able to take things that were unattractive or poorly made and assign them to Egypt. And so they perpetuated this idea with evidence that was nothing of the sort. And so the high quality of the architecture of the Red Monastery Church and then the extraordinary quality of its paintings just completely destroy that argument, because you can't move the monument. You could say that the monks got artists from Constantinople, if you want to stretch that far, which is way too far to stretch in my opinion, but you can't say that they didn't want those artists. You can't say that they didn't own what they chose to have made there. So it just has completely reoriented the field. No, that single monument has caused a complete reorientation of the field. And what is coming up now as a direct result of that is an exhibition on Africa and Byzantium. It's going to be at the Met in fall of 2023 and at the Cleveland Museum of Art in spring of 2024. So that's very exciting. It's going to focus on Egypt, Nubia, and Ethiopia. So the challenges that we encountered were many. Heat, cold, being stuck in the monastery for weeks and months at a time. The conservators devoted probably a third or more of their lives every year to living in the monastery because of the police presence and the fear of some sort of fundamentalist something or other. We were not allowed to leave the monastic confines. So occasionally on a Sunday we would go on a field trip somewhere, but it was tough at times. The team always kept their spirits up. They were very, very dedicated, very focused, always excited to get into work in the morning, always staying past closing time at night. And the monastery hosted us for the entirety of that time with great generosity. They gave us housing and also provided basic food. When I would come to visit at the beginning and end of each campaign, because I was teaching full-time at Temple at the time, I would land in Cairo and go immediately to one of the big grocery stores and load up on olive oil and espresso and pasta and stuff like that, and then go down in the 8-hour drive to the monastery. There's an airport there now, but that was not there for almost the entirety of the project. So there were challenges, but also I think it's a real testament of the goodwill of a large number of people working on an incredibly difficult project under, at times, quite difficult conditions and succeeding. It's a story of people really collaborating from different, completely different backgrounds. I mean, the Muslim inspectors who were in charge of the projects were incredibly supportive. As I said, the monk in charge, Father Antonius, was supportive. His junior monks were. The single person without whom we couldn't have done any of these projects is Father Maximus L. Antony. He has a passion for his heritage that is unusual in, I think, any country. And he also has very, very high standards. So he provided the staff from his own group of young men who worked in the monastery of St. Anthony. They were all from Minya. He provided them, he had them trained ahead of time, so they had very, very high standards for cleanliness and for work, great work ethic, very sweet young men, and no one ever got sick on the project because of food, ever. People got colds, they got the flu occasionally, but nobody ever got sick from food, which I think is, and honestly, I think part of that actually has to do with my attitude towards running projects. So you can run them, you can penny pinch, or you can acknowledge that you have very highly paid experts who've gone to great trouble to get there, and you can spoil them. And that's my attitude. So I always had a party for them at the end of the campaign. We had theme parties. Snowflakes in Sohag was one of them. So it was not without its incredible difficulty, but it was also just such a rewarding project. It was such a privilege to be able to work at that site. So the Red Monastery Church is near a place called the White Monastery Church, and they received their names at least by the Middle Ages, because Macreasy calls them Red and White Monasteries, probably because the Red Monastery is made of brick and the White Monastery is made of white limestone. They are both located, they were located at the edge of the desert on the west bank, not too far from the ancient city of Panopolis, or Akhmim today, and the new modern city of Sohag. So it would have taken a few hours to walk there from the Nile Valley. I say that they used to be at the edge of the desert because now the monks are expanding agriculture well beyond them, and so they're right in the middle of agriculture. So the last thing that we had done on site was to have it laser scanned. I was supposed to go with Pietro Gaspari and do that, and I had a health problem, and Nicholas Warner stepped in. And Pietro did a fantastic scan of the entire church, and it took him about 10 days. He had an assistant with him, and Nicholas helped a lot. And then he spent about 4 or 5 months processing the data afterwards. And some years later, when I came to Case Western Reserve University, I asked the people at the Interactive Commons that work with Microsoft's HoloLens if they could do anything with the 3D data. And they said, I think so. And they created a simulation that is quite extraordinary. So it's not virtual reality where you're disembodied and you're alone and you can only go where someone has pre-programmed you to be able to go. In this experience, you are learning with your entire body, as we do out in the world. You're learning with your entire body. You walk into the church at the right scale to the monument. You can walk around the monument. You can look at things and ask questions. I had a class of 18 students in there when I first taught with it. And Mark Griswold, who's the brilliant man behind the whole technical side of things, he was always up for a challenge. So I asked him if he could have various gradations of light. So he created it so that it would start with the light of a single candle, and then it would go up to the light of the lamp installations that Nicholas installed to light the church, and then it would go up to something much more powerful so that you can really see everything. And I also asked him if it was possible to levitate, and he created a kind of elevator so you can go up all the way up to the clear story, which is amazing. So the HoloLens headsets are giving the monument another lease on life. It's a way of sharing the monument with the larger world. Most people won't get to Sohag in their lifetimes. They won't be able to see it in person. And while this does not replace the in-person experience, you do feel like you've been somewhere not the place where you put the headset on. You're magically somewhere else. And you can learn an awful lot about the church as a result of that. And I see this movement into high technology as doing two fundamental things that are important to me. They're improving the quality of teaching. So teaching about architecture is very difficult. Students have a hard time putting together all the ground plans and everything in their heads. And also sharing. So I think that we're at the cusp of the democratization of art on several fronts, and I think this is a key part of it. So I started teaching at Temple University in January of 2000 in the Tyler School of Art, and the Department of Art History there was really wonderful, and I got a lot of support. I love the students, I love teaching. I taught everything from Western medieval, Romanesque and Gothic, all the way to Byzantine and Egyptian material. I was in charge of the entire Mediterranean world and beyond to the north, from about 400 to about 1500. And I loved that span. It was really fun. Philadelphia was a great place to be teaching because there were medievalists and Byzantinists at Penn and at Bryn Mawr. So we eventually started sending our Byzantine students around to each other, and so they were able to form bonds with each other and have a big group, which I never had when I was in school, but also learn from other faculty, learn intensively about Byzantine things. I was also, in a way, spoiled by my department. They let me take time off whenever I could get a fellowship, and had no problem with me leaving at the end of the semester a little early to get to Egypt before the campaign was over, and they were tremendously supportive. And I just love teaching it. It reminds me why I get up in the morning. I went to Case Western Reserve University about 6 years ago to be chair of the Department of Art History and Art, and I was enticed because of the long-standing joint program with the Cleveland Museum of Art. There's a very close connection. Most of our classes are taught in the museum, and doctoral students have a third-year half-time internship with the curator, so they get opportunities that other students elsewhere don't get. One of our doctoral students just had his own exhibition that had over 64,000 people see it. So, I mean, who gets that as a doctoral student? I certainly, I mean, not that I put on exhibitions, but... And another thing that, of course, drew me was this idea of a Keithley Institute for Art History. And that is something that we're developing currently. We're creating a new strategic plan that amplifies the connections between the two institutions and expands to include not just my department, but the entire university. So we're hoping to shape a relationship moving forward where there's a lot more back and forth between the conservation scientists at the museum and also scientists in the university. And it's an exciting place to work because everyone wants to collaborate. So we're doing a machine learning project on the topography of paintings that analyzes them at the, not the brushstroke level, but the bristle level, which is complementary to what a connoisseur can do. But it doesn't replace the connoisseur, but no human that I've ever met, at least, can look for patterns at the bristle level on a large scale. So that's an exciting project. And then the HoloLens one too. I don't think I could do that anywhere else in the United States. So we're really doing some very exciting things there. Well, as far as the philosophy of teaching, what I believe is that everyone in the classroom needs to be learning, and that is me as well as everybody else. And so I give my students lots of opportunities to present objects to the class, do short oral presentations, lead discussions of reading assignments, and I find that it works really well for everybody. And certainly there's a marked difference with undergraduates in the class before they've given their presentation and had a chance to teach the class something, and afterwards, because once they've gotten up there and done that, and they've always done a great job, they're very proud of themselves and they feel like they have a role of authority in the classroom, and it makes them feel more comfortable. They talk a lot more, they become more lively. So it works for really all levels of teaching. Well, in addition to pushing the boundary of what the sciences and technology can do with art history and archaeology, I'm really interested in raising awareness of the endangered status of cultural heritage and encouraging more documentation of it, because as we've seen with Syria, as we see in Egypt every day too, simply because of the pressures of rampant population growth, rising groundwater, things are being destroyed all the time, not willfully, but just through conditions. But I'm also returning to the subject of my dissertation, which was on the Nursing Virgin Mary, and I'm turning it into a much broader book that includes the Middle and Late Byzantine material as well. And that shows that the same image type can be interpreted in the completely opposite way at the same time in two different parts of the empire, and then beyond the empire. And I'm blanking here for a minute. There's something else I was going to say. Oh, also I've been looking at the relationship between place and space and creative production in the early Byzantine Empire. And instead of seeing creativity as something that resides only in Constantinople and maybe occasionally in a couple of other places, I've been looking at monasteries, for example, as generative centers of cultural production, wealthy estates, even places on the far periphery like the Dakhla Oasis, Amheda, the marvelous paintings that have been found there, and some of the houses. So I'm enjoying the process of reconceiving of the relationship between people and creativity and high quality work, as well as lower quality work made throughout the empire in the wake of what the Red Monastery does for our understanding of Egypt. I think the future of the field is going to be something that we can't even imagine because of the advances of technology. And so what Mark Griswold says about the HoloLens is that in a few years it's going to look like this, just a pair of glasses, and that we're not even going to take our smartphones out of our pockets or purses, that we're going to have them connected, and we're going to see, for example, a screen and a keypad, and we're going to be punching things in the air that nobody else can see. And I think it's incredibly important to bring together technology and the study of what we do. And in archaeology, I think people do that naturally because technology has always been part of what people do in science. In art history, much less so. And I think that we have to do it because we have inherited generations and generations of knowledge. And it's the kind of thing that you can't just rupture and then pick up again, in another decade or two. And young people today, digital natives, they are not going to be engaged in our field unless we're able to cross that boundary and work with them. An important research area that I see people beginning to investigate, particularly Paul Stevenson, is the sort of ugly underbelly of the high quality work that we look at. So whether slaves were doing it, what the environmental impact was. Paul Stevenson has pointed out that every time you melt down silver, you lose 5% of it. It goes into the air and it creates an environmental danger for everyone around it. So people today who are living in the vicinity of early Byzantine silver mines that have not been in use since that period have stunted growth and other kinds of health issues as a result of the pollution. And so we look at these beautiful things of silver and gold and silk and what have you, and we look at them, and monumental architecture, which was very expensive, and we look at them outside of the big picture of how they were created in the world and the negative things that they caused to happen in the world. So I hope our field expands to include those considerations as well. Well, I just have such gratitude towards the Egyptian people for their hospitality and generosity, and also to the American Research Center in Egypt and all the people who make that place so wonderful. I would never have imagined that I would have a career working in Egypt, and I wouldn't have without the American Research Center in Egypt. So the fellowship programs, the pre-doctoral and postdoctoral fellowships, the mentoring that you get, the library, the staff helping with all of the challenging logistics of working in Egypt, people telling you how to set up a bank account. I mean, just everything from beginning to end. The American Research Center in Egypt has been instrumental in helping me with, and I'm incredibly grateful. And I'm at a point in my life where I'm trying to give back. And so that's one of the reasons I've been going back to Egypt lately and working with Louise Bertini.